Welcome everyone to Lecture 8, Listening Skills 4, which is entitled Change, Agency and Alterity. Interesting title, I hope, and one that will become clearer. It might seem odd to lump together the dynamics of change and the dynamics of alterity, which means otherness. But I hope by the end of the lecture you'll begin to see how these dynamics are in fact deeply related and how they form the basis of a demand for a very particular set of listening skills in spiritual care. Human beings are, as are all living organisms, characterised by constant change. The basic processes of homeostatic regulation that underlie our capacity to be alive are enough to demonstrate for us that any form of constancy relies on perpetual change in relation to our environment. It seems like an odd way to be, but that's the way it is, and I think you're probably well aware of that. It's no surprise then that our spiritual lives are also characterised by constant change. In fact, we might be able to say that spirituality and religious faith is largely a rationalising response to the reality of change in and around the living human being. So how, as pastoral and spiritual carers, do we pay attention to changes in and for others in ways that empower them to grow and flourish with change? And here is the really tricky part of the question. What happens when people change in unexpected ways that don't accord with our own values, beliefs, and assumptions about the world? What happens when they differentiate themselves from us, in other words? How do we as spiritual carers let people be themselves when their way of being and changing presses all our buttons and causes us to feel that they're doing the wrong thing, being the wrong thing, making bad choices, or, and this for those of us with religious faith, even sinning? The last question is the question of alterity. Well, what is alterity? Alterity is a philosophical term, really, that conveys the sense of otherness that we experience when we interact with other realities. There's a deep and complex philosophical conversation about the experience of alterity in intersubjective relationships, and some even posit the idea that the only way that we can perceive of ourselves as a definite I is by experience of what I am not in the other. You can read that stuff in the philosophy of Hegel and Zizek. When we experience alterity, which is the realisation of self in contrast to the other, we're confronted with the signifiers or the effects of the realisation that I am a distinct I in ourselves. These are often described as assumptions, prejudices, fears, judgments, etc. This is called the process of differentiation by the systems theorists. It is the process of I am me because I am not you. We process these signifiers all the time, and usually without being conscious of doing so. This process is both a natural physiological one and one impacted by the changes that we understand to be made through the impact of experience. You've heard of the nature versus nurture arguments. It's kind of like that, except that we can accept that it is both nature and nurture that leads our distinct sense of self through the encounter with alterity in our experience of the world. One of the most important listening skills employed by the pastoral or spiritual carer is the skill of affirming the other as other. In order to do this, the spiritual carer will pay attention to the signifiers in themselves that distinguish between self and other. Let me give you an example from my own experience. And this is one that I've shared with others in a class that we've taught on this particular question. I'll make a statement. I'm racist. Do I look and sound like a racist to you? How do you arrive at that judgment? When you think of the qualities of a racist person, do you think of someone like me? Make a quick list of the qualities of a classic racist person and then ask yourself, how did I arrive at this list of criteria for someone who I would identify as racist? Now let me tell you a story. Recently I was driving in the northern suburbs of Melbourne where I was living, and I became aware of a P-plate driver in front of me who was erratic, hesitant and in my view dangerous to those driving nearby. I don't know about you, but I can get on my moral high horse in the car quite easily. I became annoyed at this driver, and I put on some speed to get past and into safer territory. As I drove past, I succumbed to the temptation to look at the erratic driver. The driver was a woman who I judged to be from Africa. I immediately felt my mood of annoyance give way to a kind of condescending acceptance. My split-second thought process went something like this. She's a recent immigrant learning to drive in her new country. I should go easy on her. What did I do in that moment? What was happening in me? I was responding to deeply embedded judgments about the other person. My response may have been a benign one, but it was a response nevertheless that was based on preconceived judgments about the other. Now you may say that that's not racism. One of the first steps to becoming aware of our innate judgments and prejudices, however, is admitting to ourselves that we do have them. They're part of alterity. I am me because I am not you. We need not admit this in a self-condemnatory way. Our judgments about others who are complete strangers to us arise from our deepest sense of ourselves in the world and our capacity to relate to the other when they come into our field of perception. Now, that story did not even describe a real encounter with another. That story was entirely about me and the way I reduced the other to a collection of my own perceptions, judgments and prejudices. So what about the encounters we have with strangers? In fact, it is when the stranger, the other, the one who is unknown to us and who we perceive to be different from us, comes into our field of experience that we are arrested, so to speak. When the stranger turns their face towards us and we become the subject of their gaze, we are drawn to them, repulsed by them, implored by them, and disclosed by them to be I. The question we ask in pastoral and spiritual care is not whether our judgments and prejudices are right or wrong. Our question is, what are the judgments and prejudices that determine our experience of ourselves in relationship to the other? And how do these impact the way we offer them spiritual care? These are questions that give us greater proximity and hopefully greater understanding of ourselves and how we perceive the other. The growing awareness of our own innate responses to the other may give us cause to challenge things in ourselves. Regardless of this, the core of reflective practice is to become aware of what is and to learn how to offer spiritual care to the other in the full awareness of what is happening in ourselves during the encounter. Excuse my printer going off in the background. Okay, so we have a sense of the dynamics of alterity in subjective encounters, in intersubjective encounters. Perhaps we should spend a few moments on one of the most complex risks for a pastoral and spiritual carer in this listening skill. When people receive interpersonal care from a spiritual carer, for example, the risk is that we will react against alterity and seek to manipulate the change that is occurring in them in a misguided attempt to eliminate alterity. Which seems kind of silly, given that it's the dynamics of alterity that enable us to establish a sense of ourselves. And yet it is something so deeply rooted in human life that we do it nonetheless, even though it works against our sense of self. And we'll talk a bit about how that occurs. We can describe the process of attempting to eliminate alterity as the "you must become me" process. The other, by definition, of course, is not me. That's how I perceive myself to be me. Nor should they ever be required to become me. Now that sounds obvious, but it is anything but obvious in practice. Given that much of our experience of the other occurs through signifiers that can be uncomfortable, for example, disgust, prejudice, assumption, fear, etc., it is natural that we act on the inner drive to eliminate the discomfort. We can all too easily fall into the trap of manipulating the other to be more like us, to make us feel more comfortable about ourselves. When we do so, we have ceased to offer the other care. We have begun an assault on their dignity as other. And inadvertently, in the process, we have begun an assault on ourselves as dignified self. This possibility brings us again to the idea of autonomy and relatedness as two correlated elements of human spirituality that are fundamental to spiritual health. It is when we notice change in the person we are with that we perceive change in ourselves. This is the crucial moment in the decision to listen with dignity. Spiritual health requires perpetual change and growth in the subject. As we said, it is the nature of life itself to perpetually change. And spiritual care supports and facilitates change in the care seeker on the basis of their autonomous agency within the systems that locate them. Differentiation, and you will have read something of that in the Friedman article on family systems. The person in your care is always to be guided towards autonomy and strength of agency as a related agent. That is, as an agent of change themselves within the complex systems of their relatedness. Pursuing this goal with the person in your care pays careful attention to their need to be an autonomous agent who has the freedom to form healthy and safe attachments and relationships. Healthy relationship only ever occurs when alterity is robust and clear. Living human beings are constantly changing, at times functioning in greater autonomy and at times functioning in greater attachment and relatedness, but always with both present and in correlation with the other. Thus, the person in your care is free to form a relationship with you as their carer only on the basis that they retain the strength and health of their autonomy. Family systems theory posits the idea that all autonomous agents are both determined by the systems of attachment within which they live and, crucially, are able to determine the nature of those systems and change those systems by asserting their autonomy and changing themselves. In other words, when I change me, the systems within which I am attached to others will change in response to me. Underlying this theory is the process view of reality that is most famously posited by Alfred North Whitehead. In his thinking, any real thing is only a thing by virtue of its capacity to constantly change as it is affected by multiple and complex causes, and its capacity to affect change in other real things when it changes itself. He wrote, and he's famously difficult to read, but it's worth having a go. He wrote, "How an actual entity becomes constitutes what that actual entity is, so that the two descriptions of an actual entity are not independent. Its being is constituted by its becoming. This is the principle of process. Actual entities are the final real things of which the world is made up. There is no going behind actual entities to find anything more real. The final facts are all alike, actual entities, and these actual entities are drops of experience, complex and interdependent." So what he is saying is that all of us are what we are by virtue of multiple and complex causes and effects all impacting each other in multiple and complex ways at any given moment. Almost impossible to predict. And that is the process. These are the processes that underlie the establishment of I and you in the dynamics of alterity. And dignity is based on the assurance that we all have the freedom to be autonomous I in free attached relationship with you. So here's the question at the bottom of all this, the crux of it, for you as a student of spiritual care. Are you able to let the other be other? Are you able to facilitate the freedom in your encounters that enables the other to change and develop as someone who is fundamentally different to you? Or do you feel driven by the compulsion to change others so that they are more like yourself? In the most obvious terms, this might look like me wanting you to believe exactly what I believe. Me thinking that you are only really healthy when you dress like me, speak like me, behave like I do in relationships, have the same attitude to money that I do, etc. I hope you get the picture. The skill in listening is the skill of recognising that alterity is core to dignity and healthy spirituality. When the other is free to be other, I am free to be me, and we are both free to form an attachment and to relate on the basis of alterity and freedom. And this is the basis of the creation narratives in Genesis and the wisdom literature. God enabled otherness, and life exploded in the universe. Are you able to enable otherness in your spiritual care encounters? Are you able to facilitate the space within which the other can grow and change as an autonomous agent to impact their own attachments, the systems within which they live each and every day in ways that generate spiritual health and freedom for them? Are you able to do that and let go of your inner drivers to manipulate all other people to be just like you, and in the process lose your own dignity and sense of self? This is a crucial question for us as pastoral and spiritual carers as we learn to listen, and I look forward to talking with you about it further in our tutorial.